About a month ago, I had uploaded a video about the Oxrynichus discoveries. Most people think that the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi Library were the first time that we unearthed or excavated Gnostic texts, heretical texts, or the books that would have been kept out of the Bible, as they say. But in fact, many of these books had already been discovered all the way in the 1800s at a city location named Oxrynichus. Now, 140 almost years later, 130 or so, in this year of August 2023, a new publication of one of the Oxrynychus fragments has been released to the public, literally in the last 30 days. That is how many fragments they found. That's how long it took, rather, for that many fragments to still be translated from Oxrynychus, was from the 1800s until now in this year of 2023. There were over 5,000 texts, scripts, scrolls, and fragments found at Oxrynychus. And so the most fascinating one to date that has just been released, we're going to go over in this particular video. With that all being said, I'm going to be reading a couple articles that were released this week about the new findings. So we're going to roll the intro and get right into it. If you type in New Oxrynychus Papyrus into Google and then click on the news section, you might very well find these articles so that you can read through them yourself. And none of the articles that I'm about to read in this video do I have any affiliation to whatsoever. And I'm going to give my commentary as I read through these articles, starting off with a website called thegospelcoalition.org. The Keller Center releasing an article called New Gospel Manuscript Discovered, What It Is and Why It Matters by Michael J. Kruger. Released 2 days ago, September 23rd, 2023. The article goes as such. In 1896, near the ruins of an ancient Egyptian city called Oxrynichus, British scholars Bernard P. Grenfell and Arthur S. Hunt made a remarkable discovery. They'd traveled to the ancient city in hopes of finding papyrus manuscripts, and what they found was beyond their wildest dreams. They came across the ancient city's garbage dump filled with thousands upon thousands of manuscripts. So enormous was the find that archaeologists were overwhelmed. Grenfell described it as the flow of papyri became a torrent which was difficult to cope with. For the last 127 years, the site of Oxrynichus has continued to produce manuscripts, while most of these manuscripts are fairly routine discoveries, including what we call documentary papyri like receipts, letters, contracts, and as a bit of side note commentary, when they say receipts, letters, and contracts, they mean there were documents that were found of a person who might have sold their home. Or if a man wanted to sell a goat to his neighbor, they were receipts and letters like this that were found. And as the article continues, occasionally, though, the site reveals something more significant and even exhilarating. As a general rule, ancient manuscripts are hard to come by. Most have perished over the years for a variety of reasons, destroyed by foreign armies, burned in fires, eaten by insects, rotten or decayed, or simply lost, and we never have as many as we'd like, so they say. Thanks to Oxrynichus, though, we have manuscripts of the New Testament that we might have never expected to have. Before the 20th century, we possessed very few of what we call New Testament papyri, copies of the New Testament on papyrus, typically earlier than the later parchment manuscripts that we've grown to love, I will say, has some commentary there. Since Grenfell and Hunt's discovery, though, as the article continues, the number of New Testament papyri in our possession has exploded. So much so that well over 40% of our New Testament papyri came from this single site of Oxrynichus, and some of these are early in date, even from the 2nd and 3rd century. As a recent and rather famous example, the 83rd volume of Oxrynichus papyri published a papyrus fragment of the Gospel of Mark, which is called P. Oxy 5345. In other words, that is P for papyrus, Oxy for Oxrynichus and 5,345th Fragment. Why this was such a big deal? Because for years there had been rumors swirling about a manuscript from Mark dated to the 1st century, which would make it the earliest New Testament manuscript in existence. Now, before I continue on with this article, I want to add some commentary and focus in on the fact that it says that the Gospel of Mark and this early fragment had rumors that had been swirling about it, about a manuscript from Mark dated to the 1st century. And when I focus on that fact about these rumors swirling, I'd like to take you to another article to give you an idea of just how chaotic these rumors have been. Here is an article from The Atlantic, a June 2020 issue, talking about a situation that unraveled in the year 2012. The article, which again, I'm not affiliated with the writer or The Atlantic at all, is called A Biblical Mystery at Oxford, where a renowned scholar claimed that he discovered a 1st century gospel fragment, and now he's facing allegations of antiquities theft, cover-up, and fraud. The article by Ariel Sabar says, on the evening of February 1st, 2012, more than 1,000 people crowded into an auditorium at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The event was a showdown between two scholars over an explosive question in biblical studies. Is the original text of the New Testament lost, or do today's Bibles contain the actual words, the autographs, so to speak, of Jesus' earliest chroniclers? On one side of this debate at North Carolina was Bart Ehrman, a UNC professor and atheist whose best-selling books argue that the oldest copies of Christian scripture are so inconsistent and incomplete and so few in number that the original words are beyond recovery. And on the other side of this debate back in 2012 was Daniel Wallace, a conservative scholar at Dallas Theological Seminary who believes that careful textual analysis can surface the New Testament's divinely inspired first draft. They had, at this point in 2012, debated twice before, but this time Wallace had a secret weapon. At the end of his opening statement, he announced that verses of the Gospel of Mark had just been discovered on a piece of papyrus from the 1st century. As news went in the field of biblical studies, this was a bombshell. The papyrus would be the only known Christian manuscript from the century in which Jesus is said to have lived. Its verses, moreover, closely match those in modern Bibles, evidence of the New Testament's reliability and a rebuke to liberal scholars who saw the good book not as God-given, but as the messy work of generations of human hands prone to invention and revision, mischief and mistake. Daniel Wallace declined to name the expert who had dated the papyrus to the 1st century, saying that he had been sworn to secrecy, but assured the audience that his reputation is unimpeachable. Many consider him to be the best papyrologist on the planet, says Wallace, and in the fragment, Wallace added, would appear in an academic book the next year. Though he didn't mention it on stage, Daniel Wallace had recently joined something called the Green Scholars Initiative. The program was funded by the Green family, the evangelical billionaires, who had been owners of the Hobby Lobby craft store chain. It gave hand-picked scholars access to the thousands of artifacts the family had collected for their Museum of the Bible, which was a soaring $500 million showplace that would open a few years later in the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Wallace's ties to the Greens made it easy for observers to connect the dots. The Mark papyrus had to be one of the manuscripts that the Greens had bought for their museum, and the papyrologist who worked out its 1st century date, they would think, had to have been the world-renowned classicist Dirk Obink. The Greens were known to have hired him as a consultant during their antiquities buying sprees. His enlistment had been a coup. A tall Nebraskan with a mop of sandy hair, Obink was, in his mid-40s in 2001. When the MacArthur Foundation had rewarded him $500,000 Genius grant. Now, I'm reading this article for you before we proceed on with the other one so that you can see just how messy and cutthroat and sometimes steeped in things like rumors, allegations, thefts, cover-ups, the world of scholarly studies can be. It's a dirty game, as far as most of us, I think, can see nowadays. Finding things that we once thought was, true, like the days we used to think smoking cigarettes was healthy for you, only to find out that it was disproven later on, in the 1940s or 30s or 50s or whenever, that someone had said smoking was healthy for you. They would claim it was their scholarly opinion and their ability to do case studies that these things were correct. Sometimes it seems like in academia, scholars use their title as being a scholar just to get the public to agree with what it is that they are thinking. With that being said, given that the new Oxrynichus papyrus fragment might be connected to the discovery of a fragment of Mark, we have to take, I think, the article with not just a grain of salt, but with criticism on both sides, whether it is or isn't a 1st or 2nd century copy of Mark. But that was not the most, I think, exhilarating discovery that happened in the Oxrynichus papyrus publication that was released 30 days ago. So let's continue on that article and see what we've got going on. So as this article from thegospelcoalition.org continues on, there was rumors swirling about a manuscript from Mark dated to the 1st century, which would make it the earliest New Testament manuscript in existence. When Papyrus Oxrynichus 5345 was unveiled, it turned out to be dated to the late 2nd or early 3rd century, not the 1st. Even so, this manuscript is still remarkably early and is the oldest copy of Mark's Gospel in our possession. And when it says in our possession, it means in the hands of modern biblical study. Us, the human population. But Oxrynichus has not just supplied copies of the New Testament. It has also been a treasure trove for what we call apocryphal writings. That is, writings about Jesus that weren't included in our Bibles. Indeed, the very first manuscript from Oxrynichus, fittingly labeled Papyrus Oxrynichus I, was not a copy of the New Testament, but a copy of the Gospel of Thomas, which, if you don't know, a lot of people would consider heretical. Other copies of Thomas have been found there, like 654 and 655, along with a number of other apocryphal texts like the Acts of Paul, the Acts of Peter, and the Gospel of Peter. All more books for us to look into here on this channel. And that brings us to our current topic and the latest exhilarating find from Oxrynichus less than a month ago on August 31st, 2023. The 87th volume of Oxrynichus Papyri was published, and therein we learned of a remarkable fragment, Papyrus Oxrynichus 575. The internet had been buzzing about it ever since, and let's explore why. The first notable feature of this fragment, and the feature that has generated most of the online buzz, is the unique mix of content it contains. According to the original editors, it apparently contains a conglomeration of material from Matthew, Luke, laid alongside the portions of the Gospel of Thomas. The various verses are not neatly divided into separate sections or chapters, but seem to alternate back and forth. There is a section from Thomas, followed by portions of Matthew and Luke, then right back to Thomas, then back to Matthew and Luke, and so on. The books are all combined into one page. So what do we make of this interesting mix of content? According to this article, we can begin by observing that the mixing of Matthew and Luke in early Christian texts is nothing new. We see this sort of synoptic harmonization in a number of places in early Christianity, including the Apostolic Fathers as well as Justin Martyr. Even so, it's unclear how much synoptic mixing is actually taking place in Oxy 5575, especially given the fragmentary remains of the manuscript. Now, what I want to say is, of course, you can read the rest of this article, because it's not mine to copyright. I'm just doing this for educational purposes and research and all of that jazz. But I did notice as I scrolled down here that there was still a lot of debate about this. As an example, when it comes to the dating of 5575, the second feature that makes this fragment noteworthy is it is remarkably early in its date. The original editors placed the manuscript in the 2nd century, largely due to comparisons of the hand that wrote another fragment called P.Oxy 4009, possibly from the Gospel of Peter, and among other manuscripts. However, in a recent blog post, Daniel Wallace, which is the same man that we just read about in the other article that contemporary scholars were accusing of being a fraud, even though the top of that article says Daniel Wallace is well renowned in the biblical studies area. And here he is again, all of another decade and a half later, still kicking around, and he is writing that he clarifies that he believes the editors have favored a slightly broader date, the late 2nd century or the early 3rd century. And my commentary on that is to say that when people are dating manuscripts, there's usually 4 or 5 different ways you can go about it off the top of my head. You can look at the kind of paper it was written on, or papyrus, or Coptic scroll, whatever the case is, like the material that the actual medium is. Or you can look at the language that it was written in, what time frames those languages existed. The writing or the hand, kind of like the way that we would look at handwriting, right? To identify who might have written it. If it's familiar with another document like they did here. Of course, carbon dating is another method, but I would like to mention that as you get a little bit further in this article, I'm glad that at least the gospelcoalition.org, when they put out this article, they are doing their best to relay both sides of the story. That there can be, good dating systems, and there are dating systems that have been challenged, because another scholar named Brent Nogbree, I don't know if I said his name right, but it says right down here, has previously published a number of articles challenging traditional dating methods, and expresses his doubt about the dates of P. Oxrynychus 5575. You see, to some people, this could actually be a fragment from the 1st century, and to others, it could be a fragment from the 4th century. But what makes it fascinating, again, regardless of when it was created, is that it sits in and around the time period. To most people, a couple of them say that it could be the 4th century, but to most people, putting it before the 3rd century means that it was created likely before the Nicene Creed type era, where our Bible was chosen as to which books we would put in the Bible. And what people were walking around with in the 2nd or 3rd century, according to this fragment, is the book of Matthew, Luke, and Thomas all sitting on one page. In our traditional Bibles, why is the book of Thomas not in there? That is what makes a lot of people go through the idea, relay this kind of online buzz about this concept. To Gnostics who study Gnosticism in the modern day, one of the things that we have often heard is the understanding that the books of Gnosticism were taken out of the Bible. These are the books the Catholic Church didn't want you to know about. And on the other hand, Christians would look at Gnostic texts or apocryphal texts, and there might be a video of a TikTok Christian who might say something in their video like, those darn Gnostics? Well, they're always saying that there was books that were taken out of the Bible, and they never would, and here's why. And that TikTok creator would explain why books could have never been taken out of the Bible. Well, now we come along to the year August of 2023, and we are discovering that Matthew, Luke, and Thomas, 2 early Christians, had been written in and with one another, which validates the legitimacy of a book that a lot of Christians in the modern time would think is heretical, namely the Book of Thomas. You can find the Book of Thomas written within Gnostic texts, and here's the thing that a lot of mainstream modern Christians and Jews do not want to hear. What if the Bible was more Gnostic than everybody realizes? So, I think I'll leave it off with that so far. I will say that the North American Society for the Study of Christian Apocryphal Literature is right on the ball with this. This is the particular website where I managed to find translations of the apocryphal books of Mother Mary that not many people know about. And over the last 30 days, less than, they have posted some information about Papyrus Oxrynichus 5575, because when I research on my channel, I don't just like to read news articles. I like to find the documents as best as I can. Created September 23, this was posted. The summary says, this fragmentary leaf was found at Oxrynichus during Grenfell and Hunt's second excavation season. It had been dated by the original editors to the 2nd century, based in part on similarities to the hand of Oxrynichus 4009, tentatively identified as a portion of the Gospel of Peter. The recto, or the writing with the fibers, begins with a word construction that says he died, which the editors consider a parallel of the Gospel of Thomas, saying 63. It then follows a parallel to Matthew 6:25 and Luke 12:22. But closer to Luke's version, it says, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. Segueing into material then found in the Gospel of Thomas is saying 27, which says, if you do not fast from the world, you will not find the kingdom. If you do not make the Sabbath a Sabbath, you will not see the Father. Again, Oxrynichus's Fragment 5575 is not chapters of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or Matthew, Luke, and the Gospel of Thomas. The sentences are literally put right next to each other, as if you are reading the exact same one page. And now we can see exactly which ones they are talking about. Like prior to this, I did not actually know which one it was, because I've only just started researching this recent 30-day new discovery and publication. And I find it fascinating, too, that that's the particular portion that they found. That's the particular verses that were listed in this fragment. Because Gospel of Thomas 27, when it says, if you do not fast from the world, you will not find the kingdom, is a saying that was a response to an earlier spot in the Gospel of Thomas. And I only know this because I've read this particular verse so many times, where the apostles asked Jesus, what should we do? Should we fast? How do we go about fasting and praying? They wanted to essentially know what processes were the best processes with regards to prayer and food. Some people in history, like in the apocryphal texts of Mary, were relayed as only needing to fast from evening until the next evening for one day, as an example. Whereas other people would fast or pray without ceasing. They would do it for very long periods of time. So it's no wonder in the Gospel of Thomas, the apostles were asking this, and Jesus was trying to give an answer about that. And here that particular answer from the Gospel of Thomas is showing up in this new fragment. Continuing on, it says that this parallel to Matthew and Luke then continues, showing a sequence of Matthew 6:26, which is connected to Luke 12:23, where it says, this time closer to Matthew though, the statement in the fragment says, look at the birds of the air. They neither sow, not reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? Oh, so fascinating. The verso, or the section that is some writings against the fibers, runs then parallel to Matthew 6, 28, 30, 32, 33, and Luke 12, 27 to 28, 30, and 31. Matthew's version says, consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all of his glory was not clothed like one of these lilies. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, he will not much more clothe you, you of little faith. Therefore, and indeed your heavenly Father knows that you need all of these things. But strive first for the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be given to you as well. There is a partial parallel here also in the Greek version of the Gospel of Thomas, saying 36, which says, you are worth much more than lilies, which neither card nor spin. If you have no clothing, what will you put on? Who might add to your stature? He is the one who will give you all of your clothing. The parallels to the synoptic materials are said to be somewhat loose, which may be due to their collection in a harmony or because they derive from oral spoken formats rather than written traditions. Here are some resources. There's some website and videos that you can go over. There's also the Oxford Sackler Library's copy of the manuscript by Jeffrey Fish and Daniel B. Wallace and Michael W. Holmes. How interesting it is that Mr. Daniel B. Wallace, who they once said was a fraud and was wrapped up in all of these allegations, is still to this day, no matter how the media tried to portray him back then when he used to say there was already a first century Book of Mark relayed to the, or discovered, how he is now, he's still working on these things. He's still around and kicking, and they are working right along with him. These sayings of Jesus are in pages 6 to 4 of volume 87 of the Oxrynychus papyri, edited by J. Parsons and Nikolaos Gonis through the London Egypt Exploration Society, published in 2023 on transcription, page 9. Woo! Fascinating. There's some modern translations that we have. That one that we just had up here, that is in English, which is dope. And then we've got some general works, meaning some articles that people have written that you can read online here about these new fragments that have been discovered. One general work was by Jeremiah Coogan and Jacob A. Rodriguez called Ordering Gospel Textuality in the Second Century. We have another Greco-Roman Memoirs through the Egypt Exploration Society, which was posted on the 30th of August, 2 weeks ago. Includes the image of the fragment. Bingo. All right. Thank you, Egypt Exploration Society, for posting this article. Greco-Roman Memoirs 108 is now available. The long-awaited GRM volume has now arrived, and subscribers to the Society's Greco-Roman Memoirs will shortly be receiving volume 108. Of course, it's a subscription-based program. My goodness, academia sure is fun. I remember back in the day when getting a copy of the Nag Hammadi Library, I got that from my local library, a book called the Gnostic Bible. I took it from the library and never gave it back. You know how much they charged me on my credit file? In Canada, a library book, yes, can go on your credit file. $265. The amount of money it takes to purchase some of these things, like some of the documents released through the Brill Society, is like selling your left kidney, for crying out loud. And here we are with good work done by this society, but under a subscription requiring you to spend a little bit of cash if you want to get your hands on this fragment right here. That's cool. So when I say that it was literally written on one page, the sentences right next to each other, this is what we're talking about. Remember back then they didn't have things like verse number 1. A lot of them were not called the book names that we call them. They were just written down. And honestly, I don't know if you've ever heard of the kind of scrolls that heretic Jews would keep to these days. You know, by heretic, I mean like really Orthodox, really like high-level Orthodox Jews in this modern day will take a scroll and will place the scroll and attach it with like a screwdriver in the side of their door frame so that every single door they walk through, a little scroll is right there. And in the same sense, Christians in the 2nd century had little documents like this that they might carry around with them. Even in the modern day, sometimes people have little pocket Bibles that they have in their purses, right? This is considered somewhat of a pocket Bible to a lot of scholars who have looked at Oxrynychus 5575. That is to say that it may have been carried around for someone's personal use. Obviously not shaped like a Bible that we have nowadays, because back then, and again, much like heretic Jews of today, these things are usually rolled up in this case, papyri. Ooh, that's so cool. My goodness. I've not read this particular article here, but I'll take a peek at it, and if there's anything interesting I find, I will, upload it on my channel. Take care, guys.